Hello there. Thank you so much for tuning into this session. This will be a fireside chat kind of session between myself and my friend Tom Kalil. Tom is a very distinguished member of our community in the sense that he held senior posts in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration in science and technology policy. And he has continued in those interests over the years. So his interest in longevity is something that I consider to be a very valuable feature of our community right now. And he also has something in common with Mozart, which you can look up later. Um, but of course, it's great to have Tom present at the World Stem Cell Summit because over its many years of existence, that conference has distinguished itself by being the most vibrant melting pot for not only researchers but also investors and regulators and indeed policy people. So it's most appropriate that Tom should be here today. And the session has been given a rather grand title. Let me just remind myself of what it was called: Longevity, Science, and the Future of Our Species. So I thought I would begin with a couple of perhaps slightly highfalutin philosophical topics before moving on to the more prosaic and near-term aspects of the issue that are more close to home, especially for Tom. Talking about the future of our species is something that a lot of people in the futurist community who are interested in longevity tend, in my view, to overstate. They tend to include longevity science as part of transhumanism, for example. And I feel that this is, if anything, a distraction and certainly a mistake. I feel personally that, all we really do is medicine, and longevity is kind of just a side effect of that. So, Tom, I'm wondering how you feel the longevity world, the longevity research world, fits into the broader swathe of long-term technological progress.
Yeah, so um, I just started reading Steve Johnson's book, and it talks about how for a long time, beginning with the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago, as near as we can tell, until very recently, there was this ceiling of life expectancy at birth of about 30 to 35, and it would go up or down a little bit in response to how good the harvest was or whether they were dealing with a plague of some sort. And then beginning a couple hundred years ago, we started making progress as a result of vaccines, indoor plumbing, artificial fertilizer, a whole range of innovations that have allowed us to, in many parts of the world, increase life expectancy at birth and until the 80s. And so, over the course of a relatively short period of time, we doubled our life expectancy, um, primarily by reducing under five child mortality. So I think what the sort of under five child mortality shows us is that there are three things that we have to simultaneously keep in mind. One is things have gotten a lot better. So if we had the same sort of under five child mortality that we had historically, we'd have 50 million kids under the age of five dying every year. Um, so that's one thing. Second thing is they're still pretty horrible. It's still the case that 5 million kids under the age of five die every year. And three, they could be a lot better. That if the whole world was like Sweden, there's room for another order of magnitude reduction in under five child mortality. So I like to keep those three things in mind simultaneously. One is things are horrible, number one. Number two, things have gotten a lot better. And number three, there's a lot of opportunities for improvement. And I think that the uh, opportunity for improvement that researchers are beginning to identify is that we could delay the onset of multiple chronic diseases. So what we would like to see is not an increase in health span, not an increase in lifespan, but where for the last, say, 10 to 15 years of your life, you're undergoing this very unpleasant physical and cognitive decline, and you're more and more dependent on other people for your daily activities. But one where we're increasing health span by having people who are um, who in terms of their mental and physical abilities are not seeing those declines that we associate with things like heart attacks and strokes and Alzheimer's and other unpleasant things where the risk is strongly correlated with your age.
Yeah, and of course the um, question of whether we are in fact compressing that period at the end of life that is in poor health is still debated because it depends so much on how you where you take the cutoff between being healthy and being unhealthy. Um, but I always think very strongly in terms of not so much the compression of that period, but the postponement of that period. In other words, the um, more or less in lockstep increase of health span and lifespan, and the
Right.
possibility that we could actually do that, fast enough that we would actually never reach the beginning of the frail span, so to speak. Of course, this is a scenario that's still some way off, but it seems to be the right way to think about our ultimate goals here.
Well, I definitely think that the goal of increasing health span is the right goal. And I think that from a policy point of view, which is my particular area of expertise, it does seem like something that the federal government is currently under investing in relative to the number of ideas that are beginning to bubble up, both from the research community uh, and from startups that are investing in these areas. So, the idea of being able to uh, really understand cellular senescence and try to address the role that cellular senescence could play, or epigenetic reprogramming, or thymic regeneration, or combinatorial approaches to therapies, what some people call rational polypharmacy. So I think that there are, in the sort of conversations that I've had uh, with researchers at our leading public and private research institutions, places like Mayo and the Buck and Harvard and Salk and Stanford and UCSF and UC Berkeley, et cetera, et cetera. I'm struck by um, the progress that they're beginning to make, um, but B, I think a lack of appreciation for policymakers that this is going on, um, and I think that there's a pretty straightforward explanation for that. Um, uh, Patient groups don't go to Washington and contact the executive branch and the Congress and say, "I'm getting old. I want you to do something about that." They say, my wife has Alzheimer's, or a loved one of mine has Alzheimer's, and I want you to increase support for a particular disease. So I think that this is one of these areas where not enough work has been done uh, to, number one, educate policymakers on the progress that has been made in the field of both fundamental and translational, and the types of things that the federal government could do to support the field, and not only to support basic research, but the ultimate translation of that basic research into interventions that are designed to increase health span.
Yeah, absolutely. So, coming to policy, and I want to come back to some of the things you just said, especially in relation to how the pandemic has influenced this conversation. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about about the way that policymakers and decision makers at the top of government think about the question of our goals here in terms of postponing or eliminating aging with medicine. Historically, it's always seemed to me that the thinking there has been very oversimplistic and perhaps narrow-minded. Things like, for example, oh dear, we don't want people living longer because then how would we pay the pensions, or wouldn't there be a global nursing home, and so on. You know, the kinds of questions that people in this conference have understood the answers to for a very long time. So, do you feel that that is improving, that people in government are now beginning to appreciate that the postponement of aging really would be a good thing in every way, like economically and so on, as well as obviously in terms of human suffering?
I don't I don't think there's been a lot of serious engagement with these issues. So I think is I really do think that there are these areas where there is a gap between uh, the state of thinking within a given research community and the extent to which policymakers are aware of that and are seriously addressing that. So I think that that is job one is to increase the awareness of policymakers that uh, of both the range of ideas that are bubbling up from the research community, the early promising results, and additional steps that the government should consider taking. So I think it's less that policy making is misguided. I just don't think that there's, at least my personal view, and I'm speaking in my individual capacity as opposed to any institutional affiliations that I have. But my personal capacity is that there just has not been enough engagement by senior policymakers in this issue.
Yeah. And I guess this must be closely linked to the question you were raising earlier that, you know, people who are the victims of aging don't complain enough, or at least not in the right way. Because at the end of the day, you know, our elected representatives are predominantly focused on getting re-elected, and therefore public policy will, to a very large extent, follow and track perceived public opinion. So that's kind of bringing me on to the question of how the pandemic has changed things. It seems to me to be very illuminating that across the world, by and large, the general public, in particular the younger adult public, let's say from age 20 to 50, have been willing to submit to really extraordinarily onerous limitations on their way of life, even though they themselves, by and large, are not at significant risk from COVID-19. In other words, you know, in practical terms, they've been doing it in order to protect the elderly. And this seems to me to feed in rather strongly to the question of whether there are votes in spending taxpayers' money on trying to improve the health of the elderly. I wonder whether you think that's a cogent argument or would be perceived as a cogent argument by decision makers in government.
I don't know that it's a first order argument. I mean, I think the sort of primary policy response to the pandemic is what are all the different ways in which our response to the pandemic fell short, number one. And number two, how can we do a much better job the next time? So, what worked and what didn't work? So, one thing that clearly worked are platform approaches to the development of new vaccines. So, DARPA began to invest in companies like Moderna in 2013 because their goal was, could we reduce the time required to develop a new vaccine from years to months? Um, and there is a plan, for example, it took us over 300 days not only to develop it, but to test it. And there is a plan to get that time down to 100 days. People are making the argument that we should, for the 100 most likely pathogens, we should have a broadly neutralizing antibody for each of them and demonstrate the ability to manufacture a small number of them so that if there's another pandemic, that we have a running start. So I think you're right that there is, a relationship between the fact that the elderly are disproportionately affected, but I don't think that's the sort of initial response. And look at the Spanish flu, it was the young who were disproportionately affected. So it's not always going to be the case that some future pandemic or global public health emergency um, is going to disproportionately affect the elderly. My primary concern is that uh, we will suffer from a failure of imagination. There's always the observation that generals are always fighting the last war. And so if we sort of overfit on, a respiratory pandemic, as opposed to saying the real lesson that we should take from the pandemic is to take uh, low probability, high consequence events more seriously, and try to develop mechanisms that increase our ability to respond to lots of them, not just say, oh, what would we do if we had another coronavirus or another respiratory pandemic? Because it might be a fungus. It might be the outbreak of antimicrobial resistance. It might be, God forbid, an engineered pathogen. It might be something not in the domain of health, solar flares that, knock out the electric grid. So I think that's the real challenge for policymakers, is that there are a bunch of people who have expertise in these low probability, high consequence events. And it's very difficult for governments, but also just society as a whole, just individuals, to be willing to, make a lot of investments in improving our ability to characterize, defend against, and then, respond to, if necessary, to some event like that.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. And I find this certainly in my own advocacy work that most of the flawed, knee jerk concerns that are raised about the prospects, about the consequences of making progress against aging are ultimately based on imagining a world in which aging no longer exists, but everything else is more or less the same. Like, for example, we still have more or less full employment rather than a lot of automation, and so you have to think about, how to distribute wealth in that world, and we still have, fossil fuels and agriculture as we know it today, so we've got to worry about intensifying climate change and so on. These are things which one could not imagine, what one cannot sustain if one takes into account the progress that's being made in other areas. So absolutely, a system-wide thinking, which is very much what you just said, is absolutely vital in all of this. One more thing about COVID, though. I mean, you're quite right, of course. The Spanish flu did predominantly affect kids, but today, I think it's fair to say that most infections predominantly affect the elderly. COVID is an extreme example where the steepness of that gradient is particularly great, um, but it still means that if one can somehow improve and rejuvenate the immune systems of the elderly, one is, that's an extremely large pillar in these various measures that one might be able to take, such as you said, speeding up the development of vaccines. And what strikes me is that the stage that we're already at in the research, with early stage clinical trials, even for things like thymic rejuvenation, which you mentioned earlier, this really makes it impossible to walk away from such conversations, taking the view that this is just science fiction because it's doing something about aging and aging is off limits to medicine, which would have been the attitude 10 or 20 years ago. 15 years ago or more, when a bunch of very authoritative and well-respected gerontologists created the Longevity Dividend Initiative, which was, of course, an attempt to persuade policymakers that there were astronomical economic bang for the buck in putting more money into aging research, the effect on public policy was essentially zero. And my view is that the main reason why it was zero was simply because people didn't believe that any actual progress could be made with, tolerable amounts of investment in research. That argument really doesn't isn't sustainable anymore. So maybe the longevity dividend is is ripe for a resuscitation.
Yeah. So one, uh, I think that agenda setting can be very powerful when you can line up a couple things. One is the goal, right? Um, for example, I think it's clear to people now why this idea of dramatically reducing the time to go from pathogen to safe and effective vaccine, why that's so important, given the exponential nature of a pandemic and the value of being able to intervene early before lots of people get sick and or die. Um, so that's part of it. But the second is the why now question. So has something changed about the world that leads us to believe that what might have been previously impossible is now within reach? And so that, for example, in goals that relate to science and technology, that might include number one, increased fundamental understanding. So that, for example, we understand these underlying pathways that contribute to aging. And number two, technological progress. So there's just something that we couldn't do before, or it would have been prohibitively expensive. Um, and a lot of times it's a combination of those. So, one example of this is um, why did then Vice President, now President Biden, launch the cancer moonshot when we've had a war on cancer since 1971? Well, part of the reason was the sense that we had some new tools that we didn't have before. So the cost of sequencing the genome had dropped from $100 million to $1,000. We had the ability to do things like cancer immunotherapy, which for some patients and some cancers was leading to long-lasting remission, as opposed to, a 3 to 4 month improvement in survival times. And so that uh, opened up the question for researchers and policymakers is, well, could we figure out why cancer immunotherapy only works for some patients and some cancers? And if we could figure that out, could we make a lot more progress than we have historically? So, number one, the goal is something that people support. So, I think if you ask the American people, uh, would you, you know, uh, like to have an increase in health span, or would you like to spend a larger fraction of your last 10 to 15 years on Earth dealing with physical and cognitive decline? I think most Americans would say yes. Given those two options, I'd prefer the scenario in which I enjoy a longer health span. Uh, Number one, and number two, we have this why now, right? So the why now is just a growing number of hypotheses that relate to both our fundamental understanding of the underlying processes of aging, and the notion that we could intervene and delay the onset of multiple chronic diseases associated with aging, as opposed to playing whack-a-mole by just trying to address one disease at a time.
Totally, totally right. So the last topic that I wanted to cover during this half hour is a broader question of near-term policy, moving away from COVID and such like for a moment. So I get invitations to speak to a lot of different types of audience, and one of those types of audience is in the financial services sector, insurance companies and pension funds and so on. And the topic that I always raise with them is what their business needs to be doing now in anticipation of the substantial postponement of the health problems of late life. But I attack it in a rather different way than they are expecting typically. Because what I think matters is not so much when and how soon we make a certain amount of progress in postponing aging, but what matters, but how soon we end up changing what the public expect. Because at the end of the day, the financial services sector is driven by public choices in terms of what kind of insurance policy they want for their health or their life, or what kind of inheritance arrangements they want, or what kind of pension they want. These are really big ticket items that define the global economy. And what drives them is people's expectations of how long they're going to live, and live healthily, of course. Now, if we look at what we can expect going forward over the next couple of decades in terms of progress against aging, we can expect, that progress will be perhaps not particularly linear. There may be big jumps. We don't know when those big jumps are going to happen, but nobody, even on the really optimistic end of the spectrum of expert opinion, is saying that we're going to have, a 20-year postponement of ill health in the next 10 years. So most people in the financial services sector think about this in terms of their current scenario. They think, okay, I don't need to worry about this. The people on my books are going to be dead by then. I'm going to be retiring. And I say that is the wrong way to think about it. Because what really matters is when the general public, in large numbers, start to expect to live longer, and that is going to precede, by some years, the arrival of the therapies that actually allow them to live longer. It's going to happen, I believe, with high probability within the next 3 to 5 years, simply because people like me and David Sinclair and Dale Shansky and Brian Kennedy are on television all the time saying what we think about progress. And I tend to be a bit of an outlier among that group, but the more progress is made, the less of an outlier I'm going to be. So when the centre of gravity of publicly stated expert opinion starts to be that this is really coming in time for most people alive today, the economic impact is probably going to be very large and very, very sudden. So I always give talks to groups like that are called something like Anticipate the Anticipation. And of course the same logic applies to policy. So I just wonder what your thinking is in terms of the urgency for people in government to actually start thinking about the change in what people expect from this situation today, where more or less everybody still thinks they're only going to live a few years longer than their parents did.
Well, I mean, it's worse than that. If you look at in the United States, life expectancy has been going down. So as a result of what researchers have been calling deaths of despair, so suicide, opioid abuse. So I think, at least in the United States, the challenge is that right now things are headed in the wrong direction. So one model that the government has used in the past when it is investing primarily in the sort of natural sciences and engineering, with the goal of consciously trying to stimulate a technology which is, if they're successful, is going to have a large impact, is to say, let's involve researchers in the social and behavioral sciences, in philosophy, in ethics, at the beginning of the research endeavor. And so, for example, with the Human Genome Project, this was called the Ethical, Legal, and Societal Implications. You see the same thing going on with AI and machine learning, where there is an active research community that the federal government is supporting that is working on fairness, accountability, and transparency. So I think that there are models that I think make a lot of sense, where you say this raises normative issues, and also if we're successful, this raises economic and societal issues, and we want to have smart people thinking about those issues now, as opposed to waiting until we're actually successful. And
Great way.
and I think the right way to approach this is not to have an official future. I think it's to engage in scenario planning. And so the model that I would think about with respect to financial institutions, for example, is this idea of a stress test. So what we do is we don't look at a snapshot of the financial health of a systemically important financial institution. We said, like, what if the following happened in terms of, a deep recession or something of that nature? Would you still be solvent, or would the government need to bail you out again? Which is something that obviously policymakers are not excited about, a repeat of 2008, 2009. So that's the thing that I would be thinking about, is how could the government support centers of excellence in universities or nonprofit research organizations that can say, okay, like, well, what if this happened? What can we begin to think about the implications of this now, as opposed to waiting until it actually occurs? And are there some tools that we could create, building on things like scenario planning, or the I don't think war games is exactly the right analogy, but things like that, or things that would be the equivalent of stress tests for financial institutions, but also public sector institutions that have made commitments to provide particularly defined benefit pensions, where there are obviously some implications for the long-term fiscal health of the public sector. So I think I think sometimes it's difficult to do this. So there's always a tension between working on something too soon and working on something too late. You can say it's too soon because you really have no idea what's going to happen. You can be too late in that the future arrives and you're not prepared. But I do think, at least as a hedge against the possibility of more rapid change, having something that is the equivalent of an ELSI for research that is aimed at increasing health span. You want to say, like, well, what if we're successful?
Right.
What are the first and second order implications of that?
That is so right. So I wish we were not out of time, but this has been a fantastic conversation, Tom. I'm sure that the audience will be extremely appreciative of the very valuable insights that you have been giving today, and so am I. So let us move as fast as we can and make this all happen. If we can educate more and more policymakers to have the same kind of vision about these things that you have, then I think we'll be in a good place. So thanks very much, Tom Kalil.
Thank you.